Welcome to Organizing in Times of Crisis, the case of war and armed conflict. This is class 3 on institutional and organizational trust during crisis. I am Guido Möllering. I work at Witten-Herdecke University in Germany, and my research focuses very much on cooperation within and between organizations. So in this session today, we will start with a real-life case from Ukraine. We'll then look at crisis response models that have been discussed before and the role of trust in those models. I would like to present a definition of trust, which also helps us to understand trust as a process. And if we understand trusting as a process, we can also see better how it matters in crises. And then we come to the question of trust preservation and really during disruptions, what can be done to preserve trust and maybe even make it stronger. And finally, I can give you a few examples of what companies have already been doing in Ukraine during the war to use and reinforce the trust within their organizations and within the community. So Sombra is a software development firm in the west of Ukraine. And when the war started, they were able to continue their business. They had certain restrictions. They couldn't visit their clients anymore like they did before, but they carried on. But they also started to do unrelated work in order to support the Ukrainian army. So they started helping in making food available, delivering all kinds of materials to the army, providing clothing and so on. So whilst they were still doing their software development business, they were also working for the army. And they took care of their employees, have been taking care of their employees really well, looking at who needs anything special. And they are still hiring. So they are not laying off at all, but they are still recruiting new people and also people who lost their jobs in other parts of the country. Besides that, they are organizing donations and contributing to the discourse on how Ukrainians have to stand together and all about the solidarity against the Russian aggressor. So wartime organizing under martial law really means trying to carry on and at the same time trying to support the national cause. And this is possible if and when there is trust that you can build on. Or more specifically, Mishra, in a very prominent model, suggested that the response to crisis, which is required, which is usually in organizational context, that you need some decentralized decision-making, an increased level of communication and collaboration in order to get the resources up to a level where they are adequate to deal with the crisis situation again, because a crisis essentially is an inadequacy of resources, and you would like to regain those resources. This has to happen via decentralization, communication, and collaboration, according to Mishra, who then also said that trust in the top management group throughout the organization and also in the interorganizational network of an organization will help to deal with the problem and to find adequate resources again. And this reinforces then the trust within the organization. So it is a reinforcing cycle. Trust helps to deal with the crisis, and successful dealing with the crisis helps to preserve and maybe even strengthen trust. One problem here is that the trust is seen as a very static thing that is given when the crisis breaks out. I wonder if it is not also a problem that the trust may be lost because the crisis breaks out. So I think the dynamics need to be considered much more closely. And we really have to ask ourselves, what is trust all about? So let's look at the common definitions of trust. Well, the most common one is by Rousseau and colleagues. Trust is a psychological state comprising the intention to accept vulnerability based upon the positive expectations of the intentions of behavior of another. So it's very much a psychological definition. Trust means to accept vulnerability, but also during a crisis, vulnerability is heightened and is much more strongly experienced. So it may be doing something to the trust already, but nevertheless, when there's trust and we can have positive expectations, the intention of behavior of another, this should also help us dealing with the crisis. My own definition of trust is somewhat similar, but also a little bit broader. in the sense that I see trust as a favorable expectation to more or less specific others. So it doesn't have to be a one specific person or organization. It can also be an institution or a community that we trust in. And I emphasize that this acceptance of vulnerability comes from a leap of faith. So we have to suspend the problematic vulnerability and uncertainty as if they were favorably resolved. And this leap of faith, this suspension, doesn't happen out of thin air. We do look for reasons, we do build on routines and on our learnings when we come to trust, but ultimately it's a leap of faith and it's an acceptance of vulnerability that is still very risky and is not completely safe, but we're willing to accept it. So trusting in this sense is, on the one hand, a mental process and at the same time also a social process. These are just two very different ways of looking at trust. Ultimately, they go together. So the mental process view emphasizes psychologically that trusting is a state of mind, that there is some level of cognition perhaps involved, but also very strongly an emotional part and the effect of trusting. Many researchers see trust like a decision-making process where the actors have various options and they go for one or the other, trusting or not trusting, although this must not happen necessarily very explicitly. It can also be implicitly, but there's a choice involved, an individual level choice, which is based on an individual level interpretation. And this leap of faith is also, in this view, very much an idiosyncratic achievement by an individual to suspend vulnerability and uncertainty. However, we should also see trust as a social process, which is about the interaction and relationships of people within certain social contexts. So these matter very much for the favorable expectations that actors have of each other. And these expectations are visible and noticeable and can be experienced in the practices that the actors engage in, signaling, negotiating, all kinds of interactions that take place regularly show us who is trusting whom to what extent. And it may even get to the point of institutionalization where within the practices, trusting is taken for granted and everybody would do it. So that the leap of faith that is still an element of trusting is kind of done collectively and not just by one individual mind. But trusting, and as a social and as a mental process, is both important for understanding it in a crisis. Because if a crisis happens, the individuals are going to try and interpret the context, but also they are going to look at their social networks and who's supporting them and how other people are dealing with the crisis. And so it's not just an individual mind trying to cope, but actually a group with more or less trust. And according to the Mishra model, the level of trust that the group has before the crisis will help them, will determine how easily they can deal with the crisis. But then trusting as a process can have various meanings. And here there are 5 listed. It's a certain different levels of trusting as continuing, processing, learning, becoming, and constituting. And the further we go down this list, the more trusting is really emphasized as a process, also in process theoretical terms. Because the first level, trusting as continuing, simply means that trust is not static. It's a continuous, dynamic phenomenon. We can simply also, in relation to a crisis, ask ourselves before and after and during the crisis, how did trust change? Quite simply. We look at trust over time and over the temporal development also of a crisis. We may look at trusting levels at different stages also of the crisis. So trusting as continuing in a nutshell suggests a longitudinal view of trusting. Trusting as processing emphasizes very much, again, the individual level, the mental process of how we perceive others as more or less trustworthy, what kind of information we collect, and what kind of judgment, also very much in the sense of Lucien Cappic, we make in terms of who can we actually trust and who we can't. Sometimes this sounds like a checklist activity where you have certain indicators of trustworthiness like ability, benevolence, integrity in the Meyer-Davis-Shulman model. And if you can tick all the boxes, if somebody looks able and benevolent and it acts with integrity, yes, then we're willing to trust them. But the processing of that information is quite important. We're often bracketing out certain information, and that is why this process also needs to take place repeatedly, and we re-evaluate other people's trustworthiness. This is very much a rational choice approach, and nevertheless, it helps us to look at trust in this way also. Like during a crisis, do people that were seen as trustworthy before suddenly become enemies, or at least dubious in the sense of supporting our cause? Do certain indicators like benevolence or ability change in importance, so that maybe during a crisis, ability becomes less important, but the benevolence becomes even more important? Maybe it's also the other way around, but that's at least worth studying and considering. And trusting as learning really build on this idea that over time and with a longitudinal view, we are updating our assessment of others implicitly very often. We are reassessing their trustworthiness, and this is not just a regular checkup. This is also a development of the quality of the relationship. We become more and more familiar with others. In order to do that, we may test their trustworthiness even, but it's this lens of trusting as learning really very much emphasizes that over time, the way we trust actually changes, because we have more information, but also because we have more experience in general, but also with specific others. Trusting as becoming then is a very different story. It's of course also dynamic. It's about learning, but it's very much about a project of the self, the identity and identification that we have through trusting. One might say we are who we are because of whom we trust or don't trust. This really defines ourselves. In that sense, trust is also highly political. Like if you're showing your trust to someone, but not to somebody else, you are taking sides. And in a war situation, I think it's very much a question of who's trusting us, and that is a person that we may also trust, but we don't trust anybody who trusts our enemy. So becoming part of a group that is trusting each other is also a process of opening out, where you have to be willing to get to know the others and let the others get to know yourself. And then you become part of a group, and that shapes your identity. And the group constructs this idea of we're trusting each other, we stick together. And this process is, of course, extremely important during a crisis that requires people to stick together, and where people also want to know, who can I rely on? So I think this lens is quite important. Trusting as constituting is a structuration view of trusting, which goes beyond the individuals in a group. And here again, we talk very much about practices of trusting that are established at a larger social scale, where we have an ongoing reproduction of the institutionalization, which may involve some institutional work on how do we trust each other, and how can we recognize in our communities and societies who's trusting whom, and what kind of behaviors are seen as trustworthy in general as a taken for granted matter, and which ones aren't. Now, with that in mind, I would like to come to the question of trust preservation, because during a crisis, especially like a war or an armed conflict, which really constitutes a major disruption to a group or to a society, how can we make sure that any level of trust that is already there is not lost? Because we need it. We need it to cope with the crisis. And what can actually be done to strengthen the trust during a crisis, so that when the crisis is over, we still have the trust before, and we don't come out of a crisis with a lot of distrust in each other due to the experience that we had during the crisis. So Stephanie Gustafsson and colleagues published an important paper last year in Organization Studies on this phenomenon of trust preservation. And trust preservation, as you can see here on the right-hand side, in the right-hand column, is different from trust repair in the middle and trust building on the left-hand side. We've had a lot of research on trust building as such. How do you get from no trust or a low level of trust to a higher level of trust? We had significant research on trust repair when there is a breach or really trust is disappointed. How can the parties involved, of course, especially the ones that broke the trust, try to rebuild it? What needs to be done to rebuild trust after a breach? But trust preservation is different because the jolt that Gustafsson and I'll talk about hasn't really happened yet. It's kind of on the horizon and you can see it coming, or you might say a crisis is only just starting and trust hasn't been broken in any way yet. We can just see that there are very difficult times ahead with very heightened uncertainty and vulnerability. And we would like to do something so that this heightened uncertainty and vulnerability don't become a problem and don't damage our trust. And whereas on trust building and trust repair, we know quite a lot on the emotional and cognitive aspects of that. And we know the key strategies for trust building and trust repair that the literature has shown as being effective most of the times. For trust preservation, we can guess a lot. We can have an idea of what the emotional aspect of preservation and also the cognitive aspect of trying to preserve trust could be. But what is really done practically in real life crisis situation, there's very limited insight. And so Gustafsson et al. Decided to do a case study-based research with 4 cases in the United Kingdom. In a nutshell, 3 of them managed to preserve trust, 1 didn't. And Gustafsson et al. Are drawing some preliminary conclusions on which preservation practices are effective. But first of all, let's define trust preservation. I skipped that just a moment ago. Now it's time to also say, what is trust preservation? Actually, it is these are active practices to preserve established trust in the relationship. And so we are assuming there is a relationship before, there is trust before, and the actors involved actively try to do something. So it doesn't happen by chance or by accident. It's not just this usual byproduct thing. There are very deliberate practices designed to preserve trust. And Gustafsson et al. Have 3 main practices that they classify. The first one is cognitive bridging, which means that so it works very much on the cognitive level and means that the party that would like to preserve the trust builds a connection between the present and the future. And whereas the present is seen as like in a crisis mode, we have to go through a crisis, we have to live in and work through a crisis. We try to make a bridge into the future and always highlight that the future can be better. And then if we work together during the crisis, we can have a good future. And people need this bridge between the problematic situation now and the much better situation in the future in order to be willing to trust those that they're working with, that it is possible to deal with the crisis. There's also emotional embodying, which means that we take the fears and the anxiety of those involved in the process very seriously. So we know that people are distressed, that people are maybe very, very afraid of the future because it's so uncertain and they feel so highly vulnerable. And the trust preservation practice of emotional embodying means that you take time to really listen to people about and hear what they're feeling, and let them talk about their feelings and show them some compassion. And this should be done in a very active and close way. Embodying means that it's not just about writing a quick email saying, we know that you're worried, but to really take the time out and listen to people and let them express their emotions. And thirdly, inclusive in acting means that when you suggest ways of going forward together and in a trustful way try to deal with the crisis together, that you give the people a say in how things are being done and what is being done about the crisis. So inclusive in acting means including those who are affected in the decision-making about the measures that are to be taken about the crisis. And if you let people participate in the decision-making there, in the crisis handling, then this will preserve the trust that they have. That is what Gustafsson et al. Find. They, of course, say this is preliminary based only on a few in-depth case studies, but I think we can see how during a war, it is very important that these practices could be very important, and certainly a good idea that we show that there can be a brighter future, that we show this compassion of emotional embodying. And so that's also why also doing these visits to the country and foreign politicians coming to visit the Ukraine, this is really emotional embodying, showing that you take the time out to listen to people, to their worries and to their fears, and maybe also express your own worries so that everybody on that sense, on that level, feels the solidarity. And inclusive enacting also, of course, in a wartime setting is that, first of all, you need everybody to contribute to the effort and that everybody really pulls together. But also this will be, of course, much more acceptable if people also have a lot of freedom in what exactly they contribute to the course and how they take it forward. So what firms are actually doing in the Ukraine at the moment, Ukrainian firms or any firms located on Ukrainian territory at the moment, is quite remarkable. And I can just give a few general examples where there are many, many concrete companies and cases that one could name here. But the first remarkable thing, which really a sign of trust, is that there are no layoffs that are not necessary. Nobody easily uses this to get rid of some staff. In fact, the Ukrainian companies very much try to keep their staff employed, even if they have left the country, even if they go abroad. They try to keep them connected via remote work, and they don't say because you have left the country, you are now unemployed. So keep your staff employed. Help your staff in the relocation processes. So yes, they may have to leave the city. So you help them find a new apartment in another city. And again, you try to keep them employed and find ways that they can still do their work from wherever they have relocated to. Interestingly, also, the companies pay their continue paying the salaries. They don't try to kind of get out of that and tell the employees it's too risky right now, we don't have the money to pay salaries. They do pay, and even they often pay in advance, 3 months or so in advance, just because they know that their employees will need the money. Something else that companies do, which is also reinforcing the trusting relationship with the community, is to collect donations for people outside of the company who desperately need humanitarian help, or just also for the army effort. And so the companies using their resources to collect donations. Or a lot of companies offer their services for free. Taxi companies, all kinds of logistics companies, medical providers, medical services providers, and also just people offering storage, offering their goods for free if they could be used, for example, by the army or by refugees or people who've lost their homes. So offering free services is one of a great sign of solidarity and of also, showing that people can count on you and that the trust in you is justified. And one of the signals that is most common in the Ukraine is that you stop doing anything business related or even beyond with Russia. So related to trust as identification, and trust is becoming, people very much show their Ukrainian identity. They use the flag, the colors, and they just express very much which side they are on. And trust is political in this sense, like whose side are you on? And this is, of course, something that Ukrainian firms are engaging in all the time and taking part in the discourse against the aggressor. So there are many, many more examples, but I should better stop here. And I hope that in your discussions, in your classes, you find a lot of other practical examples that you might discuss, and that you can connect it to the question of trusting and trust preservation one way or another. Thank you very much for your attention. I would like to mention before I go that I also feel very strongly about this Ukrainian war, because many years ago during the Orange Revolution, Florian Stachel and I did some research already about German-Ukrainian relationships. And it was at that time a very highly uncertain institutional context. And we could see also very interesting practices of building and preserving trust in such circumstances. And some of that really seems to be applicable even in this war, but it's a much more dramatic situation, and the trust preservation practices now are much more intense than what we observed. But the institutional context and the general conflicts are still similar, which is also a little bit distressing that it takes such a long time to get peace and stability for the Ukrainian people. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you will enjoy also the other sessions of Organizing in Times of Crisis, the Case of War and Armed Conflict. Thank you and goodbye.